Hi, this is John Farrell with ClothGuru.com. Today we're going to do a little intro into Marvelous Designer and look at some of the preferences and settings you might want to change by default. So I'll be using Marvelous Designer 4 for this tutorial. If you don't have Marvelous Designer, you can get it from marvelousdesigner.com. If you come here to the products section into pricing, you can purchase Marvelous Designer here, or there's a 15-day free trial. So once you have purchased and installed Marvelous Designer and you open it up, it will look like this. So you have a 3D avatar window on the right, a 2D pattern window on the left, and then you have this avatar editor that also opens. We don't need this right now, so I'm going to close it. So let's go ahead and look at some of the user settings that you might want to change when you first start using Marvelous Designer. So coming up here to Settings, under User Settings, we get this dialog box. The first submenu here in User Settings is the shortcut keys. So there's a couple things you might want to change in here, especially if you're used to working with other 3D software packages. By default, Marvelous Designer's Control S, which is typically used to save a scene, saves what are known in Marvelous Designer as garment files. So a garment file consists of the 2D pattern here in the 2D window, the 3D mesh that it creates, and the few fabrics that are assigned to that garment. That is all that a garment file saves. So if I do a default Control S, you'll notice here I'm only able to save a garment file. This, for people who are used to working in other software packages where saving with a Control S saves everything in the scene, might be a little disconcerting. So to be able to get around that problem, we can remap the default Control S to not save a garment file, but to save a project file. So a project file does exactly what it says. It saves the entire project. It saves your garment, it saves the avatar, the pose, and many other properties that you've set up in the scene. So a project file tends to be the way that I like to work. If I'm setting up a costume that has multiple layers and multiple pieces, I might save those out as garment files, because then I can bring them all into a single project file and I can layer them together, but it allows me some separation. It just depends on how you want to work. But if you want to save project files by default, it's as simple as selecting the project file row and hitting Control S, or whatever hotkey you want to set that to. So now by default, if I Control S, it will ask me if I want to save this current one that I'm on. I don't, but now if you look, it is actually saving a project file and not a garment file, which is great. That's what we want. So the next key shortcut that you might want to change here in the user settings, and I find particularly useful, is under the display settings. If you go down to 2D pattern, there's a command called show mesh. And what show mesh does is it basically shows you the tessellation of your garment in the 2D view. So if I right click, I can access this menu and I can say show mesh. Once again, right click, show mesh. So what this allows me to do is it allows me to see what the tessellation of my garment is, which is really useful when you're building garments and costumes. But having to get to that through a right click menu can be cumbersome. And if we can limit the amount of clicks that we have to make, well, all the better. So in the user settings, if we come down to the display section, into 2D pattern, and show mesh, I like to map this to Shift M. In previous versions of Marvelous Designer, this was already mapped for you. Shift M was the hotkey to be able to use the show mesh function. So now if I do Shift M, excuse me, Shift M will toggle on and off the tessellation, which is great. So the next section in your user settings is the graphics options. The graphics options, there's not much you have to change in here. Show shadow does exactly what it says. You'll notice here in my 3D viewport I have a shadow being cast from the avatar. In previous versions of Marvelous Designer, you had a little more control over the lighting. In version 4, there's not much control. I can show the lighting controller here from the display menu, and you see this little cone here that's specifying a light direction. But when I rotate that, you'll notice it makes no difference to the shadow, which is a bit unfortunate. So it's really not all that useful. I tend to turn Show Shadow off. And it's not just because it doesn't update with the lighting, but I've noticed that in really heavy scenes, turning off Show Shadow gives you a tiny performance boost. It's very tiny, but it's a boost nonetheless. So I tend to turn that off. Alternately, you can turn it on and off from a right-click menu here in the 3D viewport. But if you want it off by default all the time, just go ahead and set it right in here. The Use shader is basically using more advanced shaders than just a default shader. I'm not sure exactly what it's doing because the manual for Marvelous Designer doesn't give many details. I'd imagine it's using a more complex GLSL shader than just a regular OpenGL shader. Maybe that's just made up, but it tends to look nicer if Use shader is turned on. One thing to note though is if you turn off Use shader, it will automatically turn off Show Shadow. So something to just note. The default anti-aliasing of 4 tends to be plenty. I've never needed to change that. Do note that any of the changes that you make in this tab, the Graphics Options tab only, you need to restart the program for them to take effect. So the next section is View Controls, and this is where users from other softwares are going to get a lot of gain. So there are some user presets here. You can map your view controls, the pan, zoom, and rotate, to anything you want. But if you're used to a couple of these software packages like Maya, 3ds Max, or even a CAD style program, you've got these presets set for you already. So I'm used to Maya, so I'm going to set Maya as my preset. You notice now that if I hit Alt and my left mouse button, I can orbit in the 3D view, middle mouse button will pan, and my right mouse button will zoom. The one difference, however, from Maya is that the zoom function only works up and down, not left to right like it does in Maya. So that's one thing to be aware of. Same thing happens in the 2D view, up and down, not left to right. You can also zoom with the scroll wheel. So the next section here in our user settings is Others, and there's a lot in here. We won't go into all of these in detail, but I'll breeze through them and kind of give you a high-level overview of some things you might want to change before you start working in Marvelous Designer. The arrangement points is something we'll talk about at a later date, but let me really quickly show you where those are. If you click on your avatar here and show arrangement points, these arrangement points are used to arrange pattern pieces around your avatar. And you can specify their default settings here in the Others tab, whether or not you want your pattern pieces to be curved or flat, and how big you want those arrangement points to be. This could be useful if your character is really large or maybe really small. So if I had a very small character, I might want these arrangement points to be a lot smaller. And you'll notice when I close it, they get a lot smaller. So the next section in here, after arrangement points, is the particle distance. This is probably the most important setting that we're going to talk about right now. So the particle distance in Marvelous Designer basically controls the resolution of your garment. And it's on a per pattern piece basis. So you'll notice each of these pattern pieces has its own particle distance. If I go ahead and I set this particle distance from its default of 20 to something like 40, you'll notice initially nothing changes. That's because I need to turn on this sync button at the top. This makes sure any attribute changes between the 2D and the 3D window stay in sync. So when I turn that on, I immediately see the change. So once again, coming from 20 up to 40, you can see the difference. So it may seem a little counterintuitive that a higher number would equal lower resolution. Let me quickly explain how this is working. So in the 2D window, you draw your 2D pattern. And what Marvelous Designer is doing under the hood is it's scattering vertices inside of this pattern. Now this is a very simplified explanation. there's a lot that goes into the actual triangulation, and we'll talk about that in a more advanced tutorial. But at a very basic level, what's happening is it's scattering vertices inside your 2D pattern, and it's trying to keep those vertices approximately 40 millimeters apart. So on my default, it's trying to keep them approximately 20 millimeters apart. And once it's scattered all those vertices, it connects them, and that's the way we get our triangulation at a very basic level. It obviously is more complicated than that. So a higher particle distance is actually lower resolution, because now there's approximately 60 millimeters between each of the vertices that consist or that make up this particular mesh. So a lower number, like say 10, equals higher resolution. So if you need to change the default from 20, this is where you would do that. And once again, usually you only have to do that if your character is scaled to a very large scale or a very small scale, or if you're changing the scene units from their default. The mesh section will specify whether or not your mesh should be, by default, triangulated or quadrangulated. And this is a topic that has a lot of discussion behind it. We won't go into it in this video, but I leave it on the default, triangle. We'll talk about that more in a future tutorial. The start project path, though, is one thing that you might want to change when you start working with Marvelous Designer. The start project path is the file that gets opened as soon as Marvelous Designer launches. So by default, this is a default scene with this avatar and this particular dress. If you want to set that to your own project, you can do that right here in this start project path. That way, every time you launch Marvelous Designer, it will launch your project, which is really useful if you're working on a project over an extended period of time. The units section, the default is millimeters, which is the default units for Marvelous Designer. And you may need to change the units in some cases, but I like to leave it at the default. The viewpoint is really not very useful at all, and I'll explain why I say that. The default axis Y position is basically how high your camera is in the scene. So you'll notice as I'm pushing it up and down, my camera is changing its height. The default axis X angle is how angled your camera is. So you'll notice that as I angle it, it's angling the camera. The reason I don't think this is really very useful is because you can easily just change this with your view controls. I can pan to change the height, and I can orbit to change the angle. But if for some reason you really want to set the defaults when you open your scene to be different, you could do that right here with the viewpoint controls. So that's it for a high-level overview of the user settings and a couple things you might want to change. In the next tutorial, we'll go over a little bit more about the interface and some other things that you might want to set up before you start building garments. Thanks for watching.